tempo lakuse.
Toki, 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 toki. Hello. Let's see, let's get this presenting. How do you do this again? Present. Ah, yes. Okay. I'm quite nervous, but let's give this a go. Hello, and welcome everyone to this 30-minute Toki Pona crash course on what I am dubbing intermediate Toki Pona. Me and Lakuse, my name is Lakuse, also just Lak. I consider myself to be a proficient Toki Pona speaker, and I have been helping teach in Discord spaces, this pana sona channel for a year now. I'm directing this course specifically at those who learned through Misali's 12 days video course like I did, and who are now wondering, like, where do we go from here? What's the next step? What kind of resources can I take, and what am I missing from just taking this course? But even though I'm targeting Misali learners, I feel that anyone who is looking to solidify their foundation in the basic grammatical principles of Toki Pona can learn a thing or two from this presentation. And of course, the quick disclaimer, of course, there is no single correct way to speak Toki Pona, and I, like many others, have my own eccentric opinions on things. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to put all my nasa to the side and kind of stress what I see used most often right here in Mapona. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be assuming that you have some knowledge of Toki Pona, that you've watched Misali's videos, or at least have a basic understanding of how things work. Misali's course is great. It's excellent. It's engaging. It's perfect for those who have trouble sitting down completing a formal course like myself. However, Misali did only spend one day on each of these videos, and they did so when they were fairly new to Toki Pona. So there are some misconceptions that you can get if you only refer to the 12-day series alone. So I'm going to try to address these by walking through the entirety of Toki Pona grammar in as much as I can in 30 minutes, pretty thoroughly. We will be going through the basic sentence structure and parts of speech. Then we'll be dissecting each of Toki Pona's particles. When I say particle, I'm referring to li, e, pi, la, o. I also introduced you to prepositions, preverbs. Preverbs especially is one area Misali actually misteaches, and if we have time, I'll talk about kind of my own experiences learning Toki Pona, but I don't think we will, because there's a lot of, I'm going to throw a lot of knowledge at you, so you guys are ready. I'm going to start, I'm not going to jump into the nitty-gritty right now. I'm going to try to ease you folks into it, so I'm going to be teaching you some different kinds of tempo that you may or may not already know. So Misali teaches, of course, tempo ni, tempo pini, and tempo kama for the present, past, and future, respectively. As you know, tempo ni literally translates to this time or that time. So say you were talking about when you were little and learning something, learn how to dress yourself, for example, and you say, tempo ni la mi kama sona. That time, tempo ni la mi kama sona, I learned. That time I learned. In that case, that tempo ni, you notice, doesn't actually mean present, doesn't refer to any time in the present, it refers to a specific moment in the past. So with this in mind, some people will alternatively use tempo lon in contexts where that may be confused. There are some other expressions of time that have come to be used pretty prevalently within the community. You'll see these expressions a lot. Tempo suno, tempo esun, tempo mun, tempo sike. Tempo suno, or the sun time, refers to a day. It can refer to daytime as opposed to tempo pemea, which is often nighttime. Tempo esun, or the market time, refers to a week. Some people use it to only refer to the work week, while others use it to refer to the whole 7 days. And of course, you can combine these things. So you can say tempo esun pini or tempo esun kama to refer to last week or next week. Often beginners, looking at tempo moon, often beginners will use tempo moon to mean nighttime, which is great. I mean, like night sky object time, that's awesome, right? However, most people are more likely to interpret that as being a month in reference to one orbit of the moon around the Earth. So this brings us to tempo sike. Did you know, Pooh? One of the definitions of sike is as an adjective meaning of 1 year. It's actually written there. So you will often see people using tempo sike or expressions like tempo sike suno or tempo sike suno to indicate that 1 year concept. When it comes to expressing recent times or events coming soon, you can see in this third row here, I have tempo lili and tempo poka. You'll hear people say both tempo pini lili and tempo pini poka to mean a while ago, and tempo kama lili or tempo kama poka to mean soon. And though I tell you all of this, keep in mind that context is everything in Toki Pona. So say if you and a friend are talking about, say, an upcoming surgery on your hip, tempo poka might mean something entirely different. Okay, now that we're all settled in, we're going to dive headfirst into Toki Pona grammar and syntax. Before you, I have a diagram of how a sentence in Toki Pona is structured. I'll go through this slide pretty quickly since I'm going to cover each of these particles in detail in upcoming slides, just scanning over this. We have la, which acts as a context marker, and it can take either a noun phrase or a prepositional phrase or a whole other sentence as an argument, right? We then have the subject area, which has the subject followed by li or o. If o is used, the subject is optional. More than one subject is separated by the word en, and we can replace this entire area that I bracketed off here with just mi or sina. These next little curly brackets here are the things that might look new to you. This is the preverb area here, though it is optional. Not every sentence has a preverb, and we'll discuss preverbs in detail later. If we don't have the preverb, we go straight to the main verb, the predicate, right here. And marks a direct object. So in this layout here, of course, we can add on to this. We can add more than one n if we have more than two subjects. Depending on your preferences, we can add a whole other la. We can also add more li's for extra verbs, more as for direct objects. Prepositional phrases can also act as a predicate, but more on this later. At this point, this is stuff that has all been covered by Misali, but what I do want to emphasize here is the way the different parts of the sentence and the particles that mark them interact with each other. Notice that la, li, and en never touch each other, right? There's always one content word in between them. Or notice though, especially cannot exist unless we have a verb, and a verb has to be marked by either li or mi and sina. So we can't have like mokwe kala in this this noun phrase, prep phrase slot. So I just used the phrase content word a second ago. We can actually categorize all the words in Toki Pona by function. So the phrase content word refers to all the words that have semantic content. That can mean it can refer to a concept functioning as a noun, verb, or adjective. Some content words might be soeli, which refers to a dog. Tawa, which refers to movement. Ken refers to ability. These are content words. If we go back to the previous slide, content words are what we've put in each of these slots that I have here. All these lines here are where content words can go. Particles, on the other hand, are purely functional. They cannot go in one of these slots, and they cannot stand alone and mean something, right? So most content words act the same, but some content words can transform. They have quote-unquote superpowers. If certain conditions are met, they can take on a different part of speech, and their meaning actually changes. So in other words, there are two special subtypes of content words which can serve special syntactical functions. These are prepositions and preverbs. Then there's nampa, which isn't a preposition, but it works a lot like one, so I'm kind of loping it in there. It's important to understand these parts of speech because a lot of mistakes come from when folks treat particles as content words, prepositions as preverbs, or conflate basically anything here. Each of these categories must be treated differently. And when you understand these categories, some of the holes in Misali's course start to fill out. I'll be covering how all the various particles work first, and then we'll move on from there. It's also important to note that this overview of parts of speech, note I've put simplified. This is not comprehensive because the Toki Pona community is continuing to argue about them. For our purposes, the broader categories work fine. Okay, li. We have li. What is it li? What is li, and how does it not mean is? So let's start off by reviewing what we know to keep on a rule number 2. If the subject of the sentence is anything other than me or sina, the predicate is separated from the subject with li. First off, have you ever wondered why we omit the li when it comes to me or sina? It's because Toki Pona's li has origins as a third-person marker, which comes from Tokpisin, which is transferred to Esperanto. It's a whole thing, but basically, if our subject is anything other than me or sina, we need to add the li. If our subject is literally me and sina, we also still need the li here, as you can see in this first example. You know how each of the 12 days videos has like a description where it kind of reviews the vocabulary, so you kind of can memorize the vocabulary as you go along? Misali's short description for the word li, they put the word is. And it's true that it can be very helpful to think of li as is when you are translating. I still do that. But remember, in Toki Pona, all of our verbs are content words. Li has no semantic content, and hence, It's not a verb. You can't negate it. If you want to say they are not good in Toki Pona, and I have they are good right here, you can't say ona li ala pona. That just doesn't work. Lead has no content. It cannot be modified by ala. Instead, we do ona li pona ala. If we look at the phrase sinamoku, we know from Misali it can mean both you are eating and you are food. So the verb to be is integrated directly into the verb itself. There's no li mixed up in this. This final example here, we can see how to add another verb to the subject by simply adding another li. Musi li pona li ike, gaming is good and bad. People will often use li to add another verb to the subject when the subject is me. Saying things like mi pali li moko. This is completely fine, but just note that Toki Pona as described in Pu doesn't do this. Instead, if we want to add another verb to me, we end the sentence and we start anew. Mi pali, mi moku, sina pali, sina moku. You get the idea. Of course, both approaches work completely fine. I'm just letting you guys know about the option. You have the option to choose here. Before we move on to direct objects and I want to clarify what I mean when I say predicate or the verb. So these two terms are interchangeable, predicate and verb. Really what I'm referring to when I say these is this slot in our sentence structure right here. Okay, so while in English we may only consider verbs like to be or to drink or to enjoy or to reminisce as being quote unquote verbs, it's kind of different in Toki Pona. In Toki Pona, a noun can serve as a verb, adjective can serve as a verb. So for example, in the phrase lipu li sona, a book is knowledge. We have knowledge here acting as a verb, but it's a noun. What else can go in the verb? So this adjective, sewi li sui, God is big. Big is a verb here, because it goes in that verb slot. Then we have regular verbs like kalalilape, a fish sleeps, and transitive verbs, and li pali e moku, like to make would be pali. We can also put prepositional phrases here, and they can serve as our verb. Here I have the example, kiri li lon kasi, a fruit is at the tree. So between these nouns, adjectives, verbs, there is no real syntactical distinction in the way that these cases work. So the catch-all term for this is predicate, and in Pu, the slot is referred to as the verb. Hence, we have those two different terms. So with that in mind, we can move on to e. What is e? What is a direct object? Again, we can review Young Misali's Toki Pona rule number 4. The predicate is separated from the direct object by e. Of course, a direct object, if we go over what that is exactly, the subject is the verb to the direct object. It is the recipient of the action. It is what is being acted upon. So I could eat a fruit, and it is the fruit that is suffering the action of my eating. Therefore, it is a direct object. I can build a house. I can also want a car, touch a kite, know my ABCs, rip up my homework. Most things that are direct objects in English are also direct objects in Toki Pona, but you have exceptions like the dative. In English, the verb, for example, to give, you can say, I give my friend a book, right? So in that case, the person that you are giving it to is a direct object as well as the thing that you are giving. But we cannot do the same thing in Toki Pona. If we want to say that we are giving to someone or we're talking to someone, we have to use the preposition tawa. Mi pana tawa yan, for example. So the amount of cases like this are pretty little, but you will come to know all of them if you explore the language by reading, listening to, and using it yourself. So using it does two things. First off, it tells you the direct object as its main job. As a side effect of that, it does a second thing. It tells you that the verb cannot be intransitive. So if you remember Misali's example, the iconic example of mi moku meaning I'm food and I also eat. Mi moku e moku, we can see that this verb here means to eat. It doesn't mean I am food in moku. It doesn't really work that way, right? So that is, we call that a transitive verb here. Remember in Toki Pona though, we have verbs that are also adjectives, we have verbs that are also nouns, and all of these can be can be transitivized. So there may be some words that are pretty straightforward. For example, mi pakalai io, I destroyed a thing, because pakala is destruction. Moku, pretty straightforward. Weka means to make distance, so we can get rid of a thing. Mi weka io. But what does lasso mean? as a transitive verb? What does supa mean as a transitive verb? And what does sewi mean as a transitive verb? If it's not too obvious what the transitive meaning of a verb is, we can consider the three general trends of transitivity. When we say a subject, the predicate, object, we can translate this three ways. One, we can say we are causing the object to be predicate. So in the example of mi pona ni, we cause the ni to be pona. Two, we can say that we are making objects into the predicate. So mi yan e ilo. I cause the ilo to be a yan. Perhaps I can wave my magic wand and all the Beauty and the Beast, the teapot kind of like turns back to a human. Third, we can say that we are applying the predicate to the subject. So sorry, applying the predicate to the object. So miluka ini, I apply hand to this thing so I can touch it. Miluka ini, I touch this. So here I have gathered a couple of examples of what this might look like in practice. So here we have a doozy. What does kiwen mean as a transitive verb? We have the sentence tempo li kiwen eko, some might argue it's calc. I can apply the second trend of transitivity to interpret kiwen as a verb meaning to make into rock or to harden. So we see our sentence means time solidified the clay, tempo li kiwen eko. So here's another one, mikamai sina. Interpreting kama as an intransitive verb typically means to arrive, right? So as a transitive verb, and using the first trend of transitivity, we can say kama in this case means to cause to arrive, which is pretty close to summon, right? Mikamai sina, I summon you. This last one, our verb is suno, iroli suno etomo. We can use the third trend to interpret suno as a verb, meaning to apply light. So that gives us the tool applies light to the room. The tool lights up the room. So these three trends of transitivity are general, but sometimes they don't apply to things. For example, you won't typically see moku being used as a transitive verb, meaning to apply food or to feed someone. So if you use these three lines of transitivity along with some common sense, your understanding of verbs of Toki Pona will gradually build as you progress in your studies. So I mentioned earlier, if we want to give something, say a kili or a fruit to a person, we don't pana the kili e yan, we pana e kili tawa yan. We'll use the preposition tawa, which you can see in this screen means to. If we say, for example, we're working towards the goal, again, we don't use e. We work tawa the goal. We don't work e the goal. Tau is but one of 5 prepositions. The others are tan, lon, kepeken, and the one that Misali doesn't mention, sama. Nampa, again, not a preposition, but it works very similarly to one. In some dialects, you also see poka used as a preposition, meaning with, but you'll more commonly see lon poka or lon pokapi for that. So I have a bunch of English translations for a bunch of these prepositions listed here. And if you're watching this recorded, feel free to pause the video and read them if you like. If you're watching this live, I invite you to scan over these. So do you remember what I said when all the words here have superpowers because they can transform between a content word and a preposition? This is what I'm talking about, right? We can contrast these words as content words and preposition. Notice how their meanings change depending on what role they're playing. So how exactly do we use prepositions? How can we tell if something is acting like a preposition or not? And how do we set up a prepositional phrase? So I have for you 3 rules. First off, a preposition must take an argument. We can contrast these 2 sentences here. Milon tomopona and milon. The first one sees lon take the argument, right? Tomopona, meaning good house. The sentence overall means I'm at the good house. So lon takes on that at meaning. In the second example, lon has no arguments to take, right? So milon it takes on the content word meaning to exist. So I exist. It is not acting as a preposition here. The next bullet point down, we have the same thing happening with tan. The first phrase, tan, means from. The second, it means like reason or source as a content word. So the first one, this is from China versus this is the reason. Moving on to our second rule, a prepositional phrase cannot serve as a subject and it cannot serve as a direct object. So when you see one of these prepositional phrase words in the subject or a direct object, understand that it is serving as a content word here. It's not a preposition. Thus, it takes on the content word definition. Here I have 2 examples, lon pona lipona and mi sona alai tanona. So the first one, we can isolate lon pona and we can kind of look at it and say, we have a prepositional phrase here. Lon pona means at goodness. However, use it the subject, it becomes the content word. Lon pona, good existence. Misona ale tanona, same thing for tanona. Tanona could be because of it. We isolate that. It becomes their reason. We don't know their source, their origin. And again, this is the last one. This might be a little bit contested. I know Misali doesn't actually think this is true, but the prepositional phrase cannot be directly after P. This is just what I've noticed within the community. Often people will use P to try to indicate that the prepositional phrase is being used as a modifier. Typically, instead, we just omit the P and we just, I'll show you in the next slide here. So using prepositions. How do we use prepositions now that we know how to formulate them? The typical way that we use prepositions is the end of the sentence preposition. So mi pali kepeken ilo, mi pali etomo kepeken ilo. That preposition meaning kepeken ilo means using a tool or with a tool. We put that at the end. So the first one, I work with a tool. The second one, I build a house with a tool. We could also use it as a law clause. So we can put any information that we put at the end of the sentence and move that prepositional phrase to the law clause. And it kind of means the same thing. With a tool, I work. Kepeken ilo lang mi pali. We can use prepositions as a predicate. So for example, kiri lilong kasi. I've already given that example. Here's another one. Mi sama sina. I'm like you. So then we can move on to more experimental, more advanced concepts, the idea of using prepositions as prepositional phrases as modifiers. So here I have two examples for you. The first one is yan li pana tawa kulupu e sona. So we can identify the prepositional phrase here as tawa kulupu, meaning to the group. So the verb kind of becomes to give to the groupally. Hence we get the phrase a person gives to the group knowledge, or a person teaches the group. Kili lon kasi loye li yellow. We already have the kili li lon kasi, but here we just omit the li. The fruit at the tree is red and yellow. Kili lon kasi li loye li yellow. Note in the first example that I gave there, it modifies the predicate, and the second it modifies the subject. And depending on your own stance in Toki Pona, this may or may not be correct. I just want to say some people do it. And here's another really massive one as a transitive predicate. We have that phrase lon supa, meaning on the shelf. So I on the shelf the book. I put the book on the shelf. Mi lon supa e lipu. Again, now that was a little more experimental here, but I wanted to start to expose you to the kind of ways that we use existing rules that we know to sort of analyze and formulate new constructions. Because Toki Pona people, we get bored. There's not a lot of vocabulary, so instead what we do, besides inventing new words, is playing around with that syntax. So how can we use la? A, la, B means A is context for B. We learned that in Misali. In the context of B, A. So B here, I want to target, B has to be a couple things. It has to either be in an interjection, a noun phrase, kind of like, so say, if you can say be on its own and it makes sense, then you could use it in a law phrase. So say, for example, if you're talking with a person and they say, sina moku ala moku e kala, you can say moku on itself, right? So that moku is serving as an interjection. We can use that moku as a be, right? So it must be an interjection or a sentence. Misali, when they teach la for the first time, they kind of call these conjunction-like phrases like ken la as adverbs. I prefer conjunction-like phrases. We basically just isolate a noun and kind of turn it into, some may consider it a little bit Englishy, but ken la is literally in the context of possibility, hence why we translate it to maybe. And once you know that, you can kind of make up your own. These are three that I tend to use. Ante la mean on the other hand, or otherwise. Pona la mean thankfully or fortunately, and ike la mean unfortunately. Then we have the conditionals. As for Misali, we once again know if X, then Y. A la B, that would be, yeah, X la Y. So we know that it's this if-then construction, but often the way it manifests can be a lot less formal than that. We can kind of equivocate like la to the word so. I have this sentence here, I had to work a lot, so I had some coffee. for example. So there isn't like, if I work, then I eat coffee. It's just this and then this. So I found is a great translation for la as well, depending on the context. We can also use la to hold prep phrases. For example, makasih da pipi mute di pali. That makasih there translates to in the forest. Pipi mute translates to a lot of bugs. Pali work. So this translates to in the context of the forest, many bugs work. So makasih, it kind of simulates that the same effect if we were to say many bugs work in the forest, which is the second example, pipi mute li pali no makasih. So we can hold prep information. We could also eliminate the prep without, and still kind of retain the same effect. Ilo la mi pali e tomo. So I don't say kepeken ilo la. I just say ilo la, and the meaning is conferred. How do we not misuse P? When I first watched Misali's videos, I came out with a very poor understanding of P. I don't think I'll have time to get through this entire diagram here, but essentially the key takeaway is that if you have one word after P, you are using P wrong. I had kind of the way that I formed P in my head is I was like, okay, so if I want to say kulupu yan, right? Kulupu yan, I had the impression that, oh, kulupu yan means a humany group, right? So it might be like a group that is for human, for like human wants. So they may be like going after like philanthropy or something. Meanwhile, kulupu yan, I thought would be like a group of humans. That's not the case. Both of those interpretations hold true for kulupu yan. It doesn't nounify anything, doesn't mark possession. So if I want to say, this is my book, I say, nililipu mi. I don't say nililipu pi mi, right? Basically, all that P does is redraws the brackets, the modifier order. And I have that in this diagram here. If you are watching this after the fact, feel free to pause and take a look. I also want to go over common mistakes with O. I see this a lot where people will say this. They will put essentially the O and then the subject that they're calling out to. So in the vocative case, that isn't true. The O comes after who you are calling on. So I would say yan lakuse o. I will not say o yan lakuse, right? Because the subject, it goes subject o predicate. O yan lakuse might be to do the verb that is yan lakuse. It doesn't make as much sense, right? Another thing that Misali explains when Misali is explaining O, they really only explain the imperative function of la. So they say if we use O, it means imperative. But we could also, there are examples in Pu, for example, of people using O to express wishes. So pali sina o pona, I hope your work goes well. Sina o lape a, I mean, like, I hope you sleep, but it also has that imperative function. There's an overlap of that in Toki Pona, and I find that really interesting. Here's a note on gerunds, which is a fancy linguistic word, but essentially what I'm trying to say here is you cannot just put an e after a word and make it transitive out of context. So here I have an example of moku e kalali pona, which I think someone might try to say eating fish is good here. We don't really say that. We can't use e in this slot here. Li has to go before e, not e before li. So if we wanted to perhaps ponify this a bit, we might say moku kalali pona, eating fish is good. Of course, that also means fish food is good. We can simplify this by saying nili pona, moku, like nili pona yani moku e kala. So we split into two sentences. This is good, people eat fish. Miyampi pali e sitelen. This is PE. This is an experimental construction that some people have worked with. And by default, most people would assume it's incorrect. Miyampi pali e sitelen. This person is trying to say, I'm a person who works on sorry, I called it books, not books, on drawings. Again, you would just say mi yan pi pali sitelen. I'm a person of picture working instead. Mama e yan lili li pali suli. To bring up children is a lot of work. Instead, we might do mama pi yan lili li pali suli. Or say pali mama li suli. In other words, we find ways to work around it. To correct all of these, get rid of the And now preverbs, what you've all been waiting for, and I only have like 1 minute left. So I'm going to speed through this. It's a transformer class of content words. It's basically a modal slot. So here we have this preverb slot here, right? And so we have the main verb, and if we want to say, for example, if I'm able to verb, or I am continue to verb, or I know how to verb, or I want to verb, or I come to verb, or I try to verb, or if I start to verb, or if I finish to verb, we use all of these inside this preverb slot. We can negate this by saying, I cannot eat, for example, mi ken ala moku. We can negate those. But yes, this preverb slot is dedicated to doing that kind of thing. And I think that's all the time that I currently have. And did you know that Toki Pona has so many vowels and also ku words? And that's all my thoughts. Anywho, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks for listening, and good luck.
So many vowels. Lakuse, and that was a very informative sharing.